You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to the CraftsmenOnLine podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmenOnline.com, and we'll be talking about the shoe removal and the widow's son on this episode as we welcome back our returning champion, Brother John Nagy. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thanks once again for having me, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
As a heads up to our listener, in this episode, we're going to be discussing and referencing several sections of the Bible. We want to give you some time, as you know, I know all of us don't have our volume of sacred law handy, or you can just get a notepad to jot down certain sections that you can follow back and read later. But from the 30,000 foot level, just looking over the topic for this episode, how do you think this portion of our ritual really connects the 3 degrees of Freemasonry? And by that, I mean the story of the shoe removal and the widow's son.
Well, I think that it's telling everybody ultimately what is the outcome of the story. And it ties directly into the widow's son by virtue of understanding what Ruth and Boaz were actually doing in that story of Ruth. But most people don't understand what's going on in that story, so they miss the reference to the widow's son and the direct connection that we're trying to put forth through that reference in the first degree information.
For me, and I will admit I'm not a good practicing Mason, the biblical story went right over my head. I recognized, like, oh yeah, Ruth, that's one of the books of the Bible. The story, the shoe coming off and this and that, and then Boaz, none of that. It was like relearning it. I actually had to go, once we're presented the Bible as a Master Mason and we get our own volume of sacred law, I reread that chapter. I was like, oh, this is what they were talking about. Now, here's the thing that is interesting to me is that I think this is one of the first examples of the what we are told versus what it really means when it comes to our Masonic ritual. And I'd rather have you share more of the story of the shoe removal and Ruth, because what we're told when we're going through the initiation process is this is why you're clothed this way. This is why you're prepared this way. And it easily makes sense when you're first told that line of the Bible, the passage that's there. You're like, oh, okay. But that's what we are told. It's not what it really means.
And therein lies one of the greatest challenges and problems and some of the trouble that is kicked up as a consequence of what gets in the way. We have a whole class of individuals coming through our ritual who are not familiar with the Bible. And even those that are familiar with the Bible are not familiar with the culture to which these stories arose. And as a consequence, you simply do not understand what's really being communicated if you're not familiar with the culture. And the story of Ruth is a typical example. If you did not understand the culture that this tale was being told about, you're going to take in the information about Ruth and Boaz utterly different than how it was intended to be taken. And therein lies the challenge as mentors, coaches, trainers, and instructors. How do we prepare our candidates even before they go through the ritual to understand the significance of them taking their shoe off and handing it to brothers in the anteroom? And the significance of that is not being understood when the act is being given. And later on during ritual, when we're talking about how the ancient custom of taking a shoe off means yada, yada, yada. And if you're familiar with Hebrew rules, regulations, traditions, and cultures, you know that little tidbit from the Bible is unbelievably misunderstood because it doesn't tell the rest of the story.
Right. And to that point, we're told, okay, so you're entering barefoot nor shod. This is why you're doing this. And you're like, oh, okay. And then when you actually go back and read this, and as you had touched on, how in ancient times, removing your shoe symbolized that you were divesting yourself of all property for spiritual acceptance. I was thinking, okay, so are we doing that because most lodges are considered to be consecrated by, or I should say not lodges, most lodge rooms or halls or temples are considered to be consecrated by grand lodges, meaning that you can have Masonic meetings there, practice Freemasonry. Is that what we're doing? Is that, yes, on one hand, I'm being told this is to remind me if I ever find myself in this dress this way in life again, this is how I should act? Or did I take off my shoe because I'm honoring that ancient tradition?
Oh, so many different layers. Where do we begin? First of all, taking off the shoe is not divesting yourself of all property and for a spiritual experience or even spiritual acceptance. Taking off the shoe is the custom that was put forth in ancient Israel, particularly in this particular situation when property was basically being transferred from one person to the other. But in the Ruth tale, that wasn't the case. Property was not being transferred from one person to the other. The right to purchase property was being transferred from one person to the other. The guardian redeemer, who was next in line to accept or purchase the property from Naomi, which included Ruth as the property, that person did not want the obligation that purchasing the property entailed. And so what he did was he said to Boaz, here, you take that property from Naomi, you purchase it. I relinquish my right to the purchase of that property. I'm now giving it to you. I'm no longer going to lay claim to the purchasing right to that property. And that's wholly different than divesting yourself of all property.
Well, there's two sections I think we're going to cover in this episode. Like you said, there's some layers, and we could start you were touching on the ceremony of the shoe removal, how this was an ancient practice, removing one shoe. How is this now becoming relevant in Freemasonry as they're writing this ritual and they're trying to incorporate this?
It's significant because in the tale of Ruth, Naomi was a widow, and so was Ruth, and so was her sister-in-law. And in the tale that was told, Naomi was inheriting all property from her husband because her sons had died also. So she was left with no means of support and all this property that she had to take care of, including and not being limited to her two daughter-in-laws. Well, she was able to divest herself of Orpah, which was Ruth's sister-in-law, because Orpah basically went back to her kindred so that she would be able to be reabsorbed into her family and potentially wind up with an offspring to whomever she married. But Ruth basically said, "No, I'm coming with you, Naomi. I'm in it for the long haul. Where you go, I go. Yada yada yada." And so Naomi wound up taking a pilgrimage back to the Bethlehem area to basically sell her property. And the interesting thing is that Naomi's obligation to make sure that her property was kept in the family was ever looming on her mind. And it is a tradition at that time that you relied upon what is called a kinsman or a kins redeemer or a guardian redeemer who you would go to as a last resort to have them purchase your property from you with the idea that they would assure that it would be inherited by your offspring. Well, here's the thing. Ruth didn't have any kids, no offspring, no males, no whatsoever. So Naomi had a daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law had no offspring, and they had this property that they had to get basically handed down to the offspring. And the guardian redeemer was responsible for not only purchasing the property, but they were also responsible for making sure that there was a widow's son produced. And Ruth was, by virtue of being property, purchased by the guardian redeemer with the assurance that not only was the property being purchased, but they would guarantee that an offspring would be part of that exchange. And this is why the guardian redeemer handed over his shoe, because he wanted no part in producing an offspring that would actually inherit the very property that he would purchase. It would jeopardize his inheritance because the money he put down on the property would eventually wind up in another man's son's name. Even though biologically it was his son, it would be considered the son, or shall I say the widow's son, or the lineage of the dead husband. And that's significant because, well, when you consider what's going on with Freemasonry, the entirety of the tale wraps around the fact that we're trying to create widow's sons. The father's dead. And the widow is left with no offspring. And what we try to do is pass down our inheritance to the offspring called the widow's son, aka a new member that goes through all 3 degrees and ultimately is prepared by the brothers to become the very thing that they relinquished their rights to at the beginning.
It's you mentioned another term, and we're going to get to that in a few moments on the podcast. But it's like ringing a bell every time you hear the widow's son. It's like everyone take a quick note here. So is it fair to say that for the newly obligated brother, the plucking of the shoe confirms, if you would, for lack of a better term, the change or transfer of rights to, and Masonic bonds, the obligation that now exists?
Well, the closest that I can come to the meaning that is behind it is that by virtue of having this overlaid on the guardian redeemer in the Ruth Boaz story, the guardian redeemer was relinquishing his rights to purchase the property and therefore bring forth a widow's son. He didn't want anything to do with that. And so he said, here, you do it, Boaz. So Boaz said, hey, I accept the sandal and step right up, Ruth. We're going to produce a nice widow's son for you. And the property that I just purchased will go into his hands when I die. Well, when you think about what's going on with Freemasonry, when I or you handed over that slipper, that shoe, that sandal, metaphorically, we relinquish our rights to our old life. And we literally put into motion, by handing over that shoe, the authority to have our brothers make a widow's son out of us. So by handing over the shoe, we authorize our brothers to do what's necessary to bring about a widow's son, so that we, you and I, and every other brother that goes through this, will be able to inherit from the widow Masonry.
And this is the way you said that is beautiful. And I wish that we had better ways to prepare candidates to understand that, because this happens so quickly in the ritual, and without proper Masonic education, seriously, you could go almost your entire Masonic career and really not have a firm grasp of how significant that symbolism is.
And this is where I say that these are little tidbits of information that will not ruin a Masonic experience, will actually enhance a Masonic experience. You're really not in any way, shape, or form letting any secrets out of the bag by going over the Ruth Boaz story and basically saying that when you hand over your shoe as a candidate, understand you are relinquishing something, and you are authorizing the person that you hand over that shoe to bring about a widow's son. Now, how different would your experience have been if somebody says to you, I want you to hand over your shoe to me, in those words?
Right.
After
Right.
you've been told the Ruth Boaz story, it's like, oh,
Right. No, and
I'm going to give you my shoe. What is this?
and I mean, it's funny, but it's also kind of sad for me at the same time, because I'm thinking back to my experience, and it would have been one less question, one less flag that would have popped, because, not to keep hammering this point, but when you're going through that night and you're taking the obligation of an entered apprentice, there are so many things that hit you over the head like a 10-pound hammer. It's just, you're overwhelmed, and it's purposely set up that way. But this is one of those teachable moments, really. And unless you have, and I felt like I was failing, that I had not spent enough time as a youngster in Bible study, or, even though I went to a religious school for elementary school, that I didn't immediately connect that story, because you hear the line so quickly and then you move on to the next part of the degree, and that's it. It's gone.
Bam, bam, bam. The fire hose experience. You're washed away with all the force of the water that could ever be exerted upon you. And then you wind up afterward trying to make sense of what it is that you went through. And quite honestly, if I had been told the Ruth Boaz story prior to joining, or shall I say going through the degree, it would have made my experience of the first degree that much richer, because I knew at that point that I wasn't just handing over a shoe, I was reenacting the very turning over of a particular rite. In this particular case, my old ways, my old life. And I was empowering my brothers to create a member that can inherit what Masonry has to offer.
Right.
And in that one act, I mean, it would have just unbelievable significance, because I knew that in that picking up of my shoe and handing it over to the brother, I was on my way even before I knocked on the door.
Yep. Yeah. And I'm sorry if I keep hammering the same point here, but it makes the whole reason as to why you are clothed a certain way going in as a candidate for these degrees so much more relevant, so much more important than, hey, are you telling me that I'm wearing this silly costume and that George Washington did this same thing when he was going through Freemasonry? Yeah, and slap on the back, just go walk through that door, do your thing, kid. Like, if we spend a little bit more time talking about this, I'm with you. I think you really would be more enlightened.
I'll go back to something you mentioned before about taking off the shoes. Understand that this is not a rite of decalciation. Discalciation comes from the Latin discalciatus, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it means basically unshod. And if you recall, we are neither barefoot nor shod. We are in that nether region. So if you think of discalciation as referring to Moses and of course Joshua, where they were basically told to remove their shoes, we are not reenacting that by going into the lodge, although our lodge is on consecrated ground and it is sacred ground. We are not reenacting discalciation, because we have neither barefoot nor shod. And of course, discalciation is barefoot, and we are not barefoot nor shod. So what I think the wisdom, I love this, the wisdom that our writers of our ritual had by saying neither barefoot nor shod, they were communicating very directly to the people who knew better, who are well schooled in Bible literature and rites, to say quite succinctly, dude, this is not discalciation. How do we know? Because you were neither barefoot nor shod. And discalciation, if you know what the word means, it means unshod. So we know right away that going through these degrees, we're not neither barefoot nor shod. So although it's sacred ground, we're neither barefoot nor shod. And because we're neither barefoot nor shod, we know that that is not the rite that we're going through. We're going through something utterly different.
There's another term you mentioned that is part of this podcast episode, and that's the widow's son. Those words have a very special place for Freemasons. And this is another place where you can make another quick Masonic connection here. When you read the book of Ruth, you have Boaz and the widow's sons. Those are lifted literally right out of that and inserted into our ritual. How relevant is the rest of that story? We talked a lot about the plucking of the shoe and Ruth being the property, but the widow's son part, how important is that?
As it relates to Masonry, when the guardian redeemer relinquished his right to the purchase of the property, Boaz stepped up immediately and said, "You see it here, folks. He's turning down Naomi's property and he's handing over that right to me, and I will purchase the property." And very shortly after that, Boaz and Ruth were engaged in making the widow's son. And of course, we know that that son became part of the lineage of David, and ultimately, if you read the Bible, that of Christ. So we're talking about a reference to a widow's son that in itself, when you understand that we had a gentleman by the name of King Solomon, who at the time of our particular degree of current drama, historically was a widow's son. And quite honestly, I think he might have been a widow's son twice over, because if you remember, his wife, the wife of David, Bathsheba, if I remember correctly, was a widow. And King Solomon was a widow's son at birth. And then later on, when King David died, he was a widow's son twice over. If you look at the timeline of everything unfolding at the time of the building of King Solomon's temple, King Hiram of Tyre was also a widow's son. And of course, we know from scripture that Hiram Abiff was also a widow's son. I mean, the theme is pretty well enforced, I would say.
Right. Well, it's interesting. They do mention the widow's son, and we like we said, the story is covered in a couple sentences early in the ritual. And then you're going to go through some degree work and you're not going to hear it again, but you're also going to pick up that phrase later in the Master Mason degree, but it's going to have a different meaning. And that's where I feel like there's another too long of a timeline disconnect here, where if you don't have that basis, the next time you hear it, you just think, oh, that's a neat little catchy phrase. And they also have a motorcycle club, those Masons. Wow, they really like that widow's son thing.
And yet, when you become a Master Mason, you wear that title very proudly. And it is a direct connect to what occurred in the anteroom just before that first 3 knocks occurred. We're setting the stage to become the inheritor of what Freemasonry has to offer, which is basically Masonry. Freemasonry has to offer it, and Masonry becomes the inheritance. And you, as a Master Mason, if you had done what I call all your widowing through the first and second degree, and there's this whole bunch of stages you go through. Widowing literally is a divestiture. The word widow means to be separated. In fact, originally, a widow was basically someone whose husband was not around physically. We're not talking about just by death. If they went off to war, they were considered a widow. If they went off to travel, they were considered a widow. Once the husband disappears or is gone, distanced, they are separated, which is literally what the word widow means, to separate it. And when you consider, when you walk through that door and make your obligation, you are separating yourself from the profane world. Separation number one. So you then become the separated. Then you separate yourself from vices and superfluities and invest yourself in virtue. You go through a second widowing, and you climb those staircases in the second degree. You are separating yourself from people who don't know to people who do know. Another separation. And there are several separate, I mean, even the third degree, you're supposedly separating yourself out from the ruffians, and you are Master Mason, and you've separated yourself out from those who have not done the work. So you stage several steps throughout your Masonic development and reinforcing that theme of separation. And you become literally the offspring of the separated or the separation process, AKA Freemasonry.
Mm. Well, and that's the other beautiful part of this story is that there's many multiple angles, and I like the other connection that you can make to the widow's son is it's also part of the obligation that we take as a master mason when it comes to looking after our fellow brothers, their wives, widows, and orphans and children in times of need. And bang, there's another reminder right there that part of our role as a master mason is not only to, improve ourselves, become a better man, but also be a caretaker, for lack of a better term, to our brother and those that are important in his life.
Indeed. Indeed. I wish I could carry that further, but you said it perfectly.
All right. So we're going to take a step back. And I love, having these conversations with you, Brother John, because we take something that I'm sure many of us are familiar with when it comes to our ritual or about Freemasonry, and we get a much wider perspective. So let's do that with the story of Ruth here. Do you feel that the inclusion of Ruth and the plucking off in the shoe, that's really also a metaphor for our relationship? And that's the one that we're trying to seek or form a better one with the grand architect of the universe as we are beginning to lay our foundation and build our spiritual temples?
Absolutely. As I have shared with you several times before, our mission, our very purpose is spelled out in the first degree. And that's not, well, I know that we are to subdue our passions and improve ourselves in masonry, but that's a subplot. It's a subtopic, a subtask of a much greater task, because that is the beginning of an end in mind that is clearly spelled out in the first degree. And that end in mind is to erect a spiritual building that is agreeable to the rules and designs laid out by God himself. And in order for us to embark on that path, to be able to inherit the ability to understand the master's word so that we can understand what God's rules and designs are, we have to leave behind childish ways and start a new life. And if we are to understand God's rules and designs, and thereby understanding God's creation, both mankind and the universe, we have to commit. And if we're going to inherit that connection with God, we've got to get on the path and do what's necessary as laid out by ritual itself. So when you think about handing over that sandal in the anteroom and how it's directly connected to inheriting masonry, and why are we inheriting masonry? So that we can eventually use masonry to erect that spiritual building. But you can't build the spiritual building until you understand the rules and designs laid out by God, and that takes work, Masonic work. So we are directly connected, as you can't affect one end of the stick if you pick it up without affecting the other end. The end in mind is to be well connected and to be literally a manifestation of God's rules and designs on earth. The word made flesh, so to speak. That all starts with handing that slipper over to your brothers and allowing them to guide you toward all the things, all the activities, all the disciplines that need to be internalized so that you can ultimately have that spiritual building and become a manifestation of the rules and designs that God has laid out for us.
I love how you put that. And, I sit here and I think of, for some brothers, unfortunately, the only way for them to get that light and masonry that's promised to them is to read books. Like, I can see your screen and there's the library behind you. And, no doubt in my mind, like, I think all Masons eventually build that, their own reading room, so to speak. But what's interesting is we are told in the first degree as well that everything we need to know about Freemasonry is contained within this book, and we're actually handed one. And I would encourage brothers, if you have your Masonic Bible, at least in my jurisdiction, I know in several others, the Masonic Bibles actually have particular points that'll tell you read this part of the scripture or go here, and do that. Read those books. Now, I understand that it may have been some time since you've opened up the Bible and read it, which is fine. And that's what you're here for. And I think that when you at least do that work and tune into future or past episodes with Brother Nagy, you're going to have a better understanding of where he's going with. And then now you're actually getting the real enlightenment, not just the light that you're promised.
Keep in mind that, and by the way, thank you for those kind words. You cannot truly appreciate and understand that holy writ without studying the Trivium. We're talking about grammar, logic, and rhetoric, including figures of speech and idioms, and the cultures to which these words are being used, and the manner to which their rules are applied to these words. You would not understand Ruth if you were just to be able to open that book and just read the words, because Jewish tradition needs to be understood. You need to understand the basis of what a kinsman redeemer is, or a guardian redeemer, and how it was so important to keep property within the family. And that if you were even a distant relative, but the only one to rely on, you had a mitzvah, literally an obligation to make sure that the widow was capable of having an offspring to honor the dead husband's name, so the property would continue in that dead husband's lineage. And equally so, we have a tradition within Freemasonry of handing down light and preserving it for every single generation. And without widows' sons as offsprings of the separation process, how are we as a family going to guarantee that what we need to make sure is handed down, that property, that inheritance, gets into the right hands and the family name continues? Starts with handing over that sandal.
Very well said. Well, big thanks again to our guest this week, Brother John Nagy, for coming on this episode of the Craftsman Online podcast. Can't wait until you come back. I know you're going to ask me. We'll have him back on our Monday, June 6th episode, where we will be discussing the perfect points of entrance.
Neat topic. That's a fun one. And we'll be rolling up our sleeves on that one too.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can just tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We are available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Ta-da!
Ba-dum-bum.
Beep, beep.